Crawling in My Skin by Silence is Golden 15. Read by My Lost and Found. Summary. Didn't anyone ever teach space pirates to keep their hands to themselves? The worst thing about being a defender of the universe, Shiro had decided, was the other people that weren't innocent civilians or Empire soldiers. A great deal of those types of people didn't actually care about the war. They were just trying to make a quick buck. On top of their uncaring demeanor, they also always managed to show up at the absolutely worst possible times. Like right now. Snatched up by a veritable army of space pirates who couldn't give a rat's ass that they just captured the paladins of VOLTRON. They didn't seem like people trying to make the universe better. All they saw were dollar signs, or GAC signs, or whatever the hell currency these guys dealt in. The alien pacing in front of them may as well have been a Galrin anyway, all hulking purple muscle. The only difference was the eyes that glowed green instead of gold, and the wicked maw of serrated teeth. They'd all had their helmets removed and their bayards taken. Shiro with an inhibitor band wrapped around his arm, and were bound on their knees, elbows pulled back and draped over a bar behind them, with their wrists bound as well. A stress position he was all too familiar with, but it had to be painful for Pidge, who had her arms yanked up much further than the rest of them thanks to her height.
So much merchandise, so little time,
brooded their captor in an impossibly deep voice, earning himself a venomous glare from Shiro.
Where shall I sell you all?
Lance sneered and opened his mouth before noticing how Shiro shook his head at him. Things weren't too awful right now. The last thing they needed was to piss off this guy and make it worse, and therefore more difficult to get away. He'd learned silent compliance was best until an opportunity revealed itself. Then, the alien stopped in front of Keith, and Shiro immediately forgot all of his own advice. Hey, don't! The alien tapped a button on his belt, and Shiro's teeth slammed shut at the electric current that ran through the bar. All 5 of them tensed and let out muffled cries of pain at the shock, an extra way to keep them in line. Punish all of them for the actions of one. The others all staggered for the moment the electricity turned off, but Shiro fought to keep himself as upright as he could. He was the leader. He had to portray strength, even as his heart began to race at the look that the pirate was wearing as he loomed over Keith. Slowly, he knelt down. Keith maintained eye contact, that familiar snarl plastered on his lips, unmoving even when the alien chuckled at him.
You're a pretty one, aren't you?
He purred, making Shiro's stomach twist. And then he reached out and grasped Keith's face firmly by the chin in his clawed hand. Shiro didn't need to look to know the rest of the team would be making the same expression of horror as he watched as Keith's pupils shrunk into pinpricks and his breath picked up. They all knew how Keith felt about being touched. Some days even Shiro wasn't allowed into his personal bubble. And now, here he was with this stranger, this enemy, putting his hands on him. Rage was already warming in his blood as the alien turned Keith's head to one side, then the other, then squeezed his jaw open and peered in at his teeth. Keith's cheeks were bright red with humiliation. The pirate relaxed his grip and Keith let close his mouth, but didn't let go of him as he stared consideringly. Just barely, Shiro could make out how his thumb dragged over Keith's cheekbone.
Yes, you might be worth the trip to the pleasure barges.
Shiro's throat constricted. A million different protests all sprang forward, all crowded against each other in the fight to get out. But Lance beat him to it, by openly scoffing and attracting the pirate's attention. Who? Mullet? Come on. Why bother with him when I'm right here? He followed it up with a cocky smirk, but Shiro saw right through it. It wasn't an insult or a brag. Lance was scared, but he was doing it to get the alien's attention off of Keith. He never thought he'd say this, but thank God for Lance. The pirate tilted his head, and with an expression of amusement, let go of Keith and stepped back. Keith immediately dropped his chin to his chest plate, his back shuddering with his breath. And Shiro wanted nothing more at that moment than to comfort him, but the alien was advancing on Lance now, and he had to keep watch over his whole team. The alien did the same to Lance that he had done to Keith, grasping his face and doing the same inspection. Lance's eyes burned like blue fire the entire time, refusing to be cowed, and with a huff of a laugh, the man backed off again. You have a point. You can go with him. Lance gulped and dropped his eyes to the floor as the man's gaze moved to Pidge. She gave him a fierce glare and bared her teeth, daring him to get close. But this time, he didn't even kneel down. I've heard stories about you, he said with a playful smile. You're supposed to be the smart one. Maybe one of the research camps will take you. Pidge snarled, but wary of the button on his belt, said nothing. He advanced to Hunk, who flinched and looked away. But thankfully, he almost seemed bored with the yellow paladin. Big enough. A normal labor camp would pay all right for you. He turned back to Shiro and straightened as far as the bindings would allow. Breathing deeply and evenly, he imagined dismembering the alien in as much gory detail as he could. As for you, he prodded at Shiro's knee with a booted foot. I'm sure Zarkon will pay handsomely for the return of his champion. Out of the corners of his eyes, Shiro examined the team. Pidge and Lance looked pissed. Hunk was scared, all to be expected. But Keith was still shuddering, scraping his chin against his shoulder to try and get off the man's touch. Shiro's heart hurt. Better get comfortable, the man mocked as he turned back towards the door. You're in for a long time. The moment the door slid shut behind them, they all let out a relieved breath and sagged in their bindings. And for a minute or two, there was a tense silence in the room. Then Shiro pulled himself together. All right, team. Any ideas? Pidge wriggled a bit and frowned. I can't quite reach my gauntlet, so hacking is out of the question. I've been trying to wiggle out of these things the whole time, Lance said miserably. No dice. Hunk leaned his weight forward on his elbows and tried to pull the bar free of the wall, but he didn't have enough leverage in this position, and after a few minutes of struggling, gave Shiro a disappointed shake of his head. Shiro glanced at Keith, but immediately determined he wasn't in any shape to be assisting with the escape. He was still holding too still, staring at the floor and shuddering. He really didn't like being touched, and Shiro could almost see the bad memories swallowing him up. Maybe if Red picked up on his distress, then they could do something, but there were no guarantees. Wait, that might be an idea. Guys, remember how we've been practicing communicating with our lions? The other three nodded. Pidge had a twinkle in her eye as she was picking up on his plan. Okay, let's all do the same thing we do back on the training deck and try to call for them. Even if only one comes, we'll have a chance. Pidge immediately bowed her head and closed her eyes, brow furrowing as she concentrated on calling for Green. Hunk and Lance copied her, Hunk wearing a worried frown and Lance's lips moving as he whispered words to help him focus. Shiro observed for only a moment before following suit. Black was far away. Their connection stretched taut. With how rocky their relationship had been, he almost didn't expect her to come, but he stubbornly pushed through anyway. He had to have faith and trust his lion. She responded with a lazy brush, probably thinking that it was another training exercise, until she felt Shiro's tension and barely restrained panic, and their bond sharpened like supernovas. Help, he thought. Please. Stars twinkled behind his eyes. I am coming, Paladin. His next breath was a sigh of relief. Black's coming. I got 3 to green, Pidge said with a small smile. Blue's coming too. And yellow. Good job, guys. Hopefully, when all the lions take off, Allura will get the hint and follow. He shot another look at Keith. Hopefully, it wasn't just wishful thinking, but he seemed to be doing a little better. His breathing was slower, at any rate, and he had stopped trying to rub off his skin. Still, the sooner the lions got here, the better. It didn't take long. Shiro estimated about 10 minutes before the ship they were on was rocking violently underneath them, and Black was singing in his head. And 3 minutes after that, the princess was busting through the door into their cell, dressed in her battlesuit and armed with a staff. Paladins! She exclaimed, running over to rend apart Shiro's binding with her Altean strength. Captured by space pirates, of all things, really? She finished with Shiro and moved on to Pidge, who was already arguing back at her. Come on, Allura, there was like 40 of them and only 5 of us. The conversation continued in the background, but Shiro blocked it out in favor of giving Keith his full attention, as he moved to get him free. The moment he touched him, however, Keith made an unhappy sound in the back of his throat and flinched away. Hey, Shiro murmured to him, pitching his voice low and soothing. It's okay. I'm just going to take these off and then I'll stop touching you. All right? I promise. Keith's only answer was a whimper and the further hunch of his shoulders, but Shiro didn't really have a choice. The bindings all had to come off, so as quickly as he could, and murmuring apologies the whole time, he untied the ropes around his wrists and ankles and stepped back to give him room to pull away from the bar. Shiro, is Keith injured? He glanced over at his shoulder at Allura. The rest of the team had gotten themselves untied and were bustling around the room in search of their helmets and bayards, while he'd been handling Keith. No, he just needs a second. Allura frowned. All right, but don't take too long. The sooner we get off this ship, the better. Shiro gave an understanding nod and turned back to Keith, who was staggering to his feet. He was still pale, and his eyes were a little wild, but the look he was giving Shiro was steady, and his fists were clenched at his sides. You ready to get home? Keith didn't speak, but he did give a determined nod. All right, team, let's get moving. The moment they returned to the castle, Keith retreated to his bedroom, probably to wrap himself up in every blanket he could find and hide for a little while. Not a single one of them said anything, not even Lance. He would probably be okay by the next morning, maybe a little quiet, and Shiro would probably have to talk to him and reassure him that he wasn't wrong for reacting the way he did. But in a couple of days, the whole thing would blow over, and Keith would be fine. In the interim, Shiro found time to thank Lance for how he'd diverted the alien's attention, to which Lance responded with flustered cheeks, and insisted that it was no problem whatsoever. Shiro still hated space pirates. Sorry if the quality of this pod isn't up to standards. I actually recorded this one a while ago, but for some reason it got into the wrong folder, so I didn't realize I hadn't submitted it, and then I found it, and well, I might as well post it, but sorry if you can hear noises in the background.